Hello everyone, David Piercy here, and welcome into this episode of my Tribute to Jimi Hendrix YouTube channel. Now today I'm going to share something with you that I think is very special. This is an interview. Well, it's not really an interview. It's a conversation that I had 27 years ago with a couple of legendary musicians and a couple of my rock and roll heroes, Steve Winwood and Jim Capaldi from Traffic. Now, a little bit of a backstory on how this all happened. I met Steve Winwood first in 1986. I fast talked my way into a backstage area where he was doing his first ever Nashville hometown concert. And I gave him, and this was in the era of cassettes, I gave him a cassette of the outtakes of the Voodoo Child sessions from Electric Ladyland. And aficionados will know exactly what I'm talking about. And on the other side was a bootleg of Blind Faith in concert. And I remember his manager laughing, this happy laugh when I gave him that stuff. And I also gave him some photographs of him and Jimi together, which his wife thought were really cool and took from me. And he was very cordial. He signed a record album for me. We shook hands, and I went my way, and he put on a great show. And then flash forward 3 years when this book comes out, Steve's autobiography, which is called Roll With It. And like I said, it came out in 1989. You can probably still find a copy if you dig a little bit, maybe on Amazon or eBay. And it's definitely worth a read. So in this book, he mentions on page 119 our meeting. He doesn't mention me by name, but he mentions meeting a guy before the show that gave him this stuff. So with that information in mind, I wrote him a letter and said, I'm the guy that gave you that stuff, and I have a bunch more stuff I'd love to show you. And would you believe it? He called me. He called me one night. This is in October of 1990, and I said, I've got more stuff than I can load in a truck and take to you. Is there any way you could come here? And he conferred with somebody off camera or off the phone, and came back and said, well, Jim Capaldi's in town for a visit. Would it be okay if I brought him? Well, yeah. So the only thing cooler than meeting one of your rock and roll heroes is hanging out with them at your house. And that's exactly what happened in early October 1990. And he and Capaldi came here. I showed them videos. They'd never seen the Albert Hall stuff, which is in collector circles, where their friend Chris Wood comes out and jams on flute. And Capaldi even found himself in the footage from a backstage shot, standing behind the amps, shaking a tambourine. And they looked around my collection there and just really thought it was cool. But because it was the first time we'd met, I didn't really want to shove a microphone in their faces and say, let's do an interview. So they came and went. It was a great afternoon, and took some pictures. A friend of mine was there. We took pictures, and but I thought I'll never get those two guys in the same room again to do a proper sit down and talk. So flash forward, September the 18th, 1995, 5 years later. And I'd stayed in touch with Steve, and in fact he thought my collection was so cool, he asked me if I could help him find some collectibles from his career. And I did that, posters and photos and a lot of bootleg CDs, which he really enjoyed. So it was, like I said, September the 18th, 1995, the 25th anniversary of Hendrix's death. So I called him, said I got some new stuff to show you, to bring you, and could I come up? And he said, yeah. And he said, Jim Capaldi's here. So, wow. So here's my shot. So I took a recording device and went and we visited, and I gave him some new items. And then I told him it's the 25th anniversary of Hendrix's death. I said, you guys knew him. You jammed with him, you recorded with him. Is there any way we could talk about it on tape that I could share? At the time, I was a contributor to Steve Roby's Straight Ahead magazine, which was one of the top Hendrix fan magazines. And they looked at each other and kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, well, sure, I guess so. So I set the recording device on the table, and I just started asking them questions. So really wasn't an interview. We were just talking. So they had some really interesting things to say and really interesting remembrances. Now, aficionados may try and pick some of the things they said apart, saying, well, the timeline is not right for this or that. But, don't listen to it in that light. Just go with it and hear it as they remembered it. So I'm going to do some subtitles. Sometimes some of the conversation is lost because they talk a little bit low, but I'm going to do some captions and subtitles so that you can pick up on this. But they had a lot of really interesting things to say, and it's just fascinating to listen to them remember back then. So this runs about 30 minutes. So enjoy this and flash back with me. Steve Winwood and Jim Capaldi, September the 18th, 1995. So Chaz brought Jimmy. His first jam was with your band, Deep Feeling.
Deep Feeling. I think it was the Bag of Nails.
The Bag of Nails.
And he made phone calls, and a lot of people came in like, we didn't have a set. I don't know, blues. I don't know what we did as a set.
Right. Was he wound up to 10? Was he like unbearable volume?
No, he used our equipment. The club we were playing in.
Right.
He just had a guitar. He just plugged in the same
straight
equipment.
in and turned loose.
Yeah, but I mean, we were all impressed.
Wow.
I mean, all of us, the band especially.
So this had to be late '66, I guess. That
yeah,
happened. Wow.
Yeah, that's right. And our bass player, Dave Meredith, who lived near me in Eckington, in Worcestershire, little pub there called the Bell, Eckington.
Right.
Try that the Bell. Try, yeah. He said he wanted him and John wanted me and him to go and audition.
Right.
The next day, and he said, I don't know where you were. You disappeared or something. Because we used to just all hang out in London and we'd be running around.
Well, that could have changed.
He said they really liked it and they wanted me and me to audition. So he always says to me when I see him, we could have been in the Experience.
Great story.
I said, I don't think so, Dave. So, you never know. So, and then, Jimmy was around then.
Right.
We all became friends.
Now, when I showed you the footage of the Royal Albert Hall gig from '69, and you pointed out yourself standing there behind the amp, keeping time with the tambourine. Now, you were in a band and that wasn't Traffic that opened that show. Now, what was the name of that band?
That was called Mace, Capaldi, Wood, and Frog.
Right. So was that just a one-off show, or did you do a series of gigs with them?
We did a few gigs, but that was probably the only gig with Jimmy, I think.
Yeah. Amongst collectors, that's one of the most highly prized shows. I mean, for content and just the quality of the music that was happening that night. And we're really hoping that film finally makes it, into circulation. There's some excerpts from it, like I showed you, that are circulating amongst collectors. But now that the family is in control of the legacy, we're hoping that movie, with a lot of other footage that they shot on that tour, finally comes to life.
Right. Just Jimmy's performance there, the Albert Hall.
Right. Well, they might have gotten the whole gig. We don't know. But we know the guy that has the film. We are just waiting to see, now that the family's with it, that maybe he'll let all that go.
That'll belong to him, though.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
He just played blues. He played a lot of blues. It was like towards the end, actually.
Right.
He wasn't even playing a proper set.
Really?
Yeah, he was like, Mitch was there. He was just playing blues. That's all he did.
That's really what he
didn't do
was.
any real experienced show. No.
He didn't do
No. Just blues. It was like just blues.
Well, what about you, Steve? How did you come to meet him the first time, or did you see him in the club before you actually ever met and played music together?
I can't remember.
We just knew him, didn't we?
I don't know how I got to know him. I remember where I first saw him. I remember playing that gig in
Sweden.
Sweden. Yeah.
With Jimi.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Assuming probably.
I remember. Yeah, I think that's probably where I first saw him.
Right. Now
the Electric Lady stuff is pretty famous amongst collectors, and you just did like 1 or 2 takes of...
2 takes. You have to take 1.
Right, right. Now, all the voices you hear in the background, were there actually a crowd of people sitting there in the studio while you played, or were they outside
No,
the
they
booth?
were outside, not in a booth, in like a lounge area.
That wasn't Electric Ladyland.
Wasn't
Voodoo
it?
Child Slight Return.
Where was it?
They didn't have Electric Ladyland then.
Right.
They hadn't even
Might
got
have
it.
been the record plant.
It was at a record plant.
The record plant on,
That's where it
on
was.
the
'Cause
same...
I went to Nassau, first
Yeah.
trip to Nassau, and then you and Chris played on the... I went off to meet Hammer in Nassau.
Okay.
And then because he was in the same studio, because I remember we were cutting Pearly Queen.
That's
right
right.
then.
That's
I remember
right.
he was playing, used to come in and mess around, play on the hi-hat,
That's right.
you know,
That's right.
just chat and stuff,
Yeah.
plonk
yeah,
around.
yeah, that's right.
And we also saw him in the studio there, and he did, where's that track when he does a big intro? He goes, dun, he goes, there's a big intro, there's a big intro, and then he goes into the song.
Is this from Electric Ladyland?
Yeah, early. Do you know the track I mean?
Because there was one called House Burning Down where he did this big flamenco type thing.
Yes.
You know,
Intro.
and the
And then
chorus
it goes
behind
into
him, and
the-
he did all the thing, and then
Into the track. I was there
Right.
when he recorded it.
Right.
I was sat in the control room. We must have all been. And he came back in and I said, great. I said,
Right.
that was great. And he said, they're just getting a bit flash. Because he used to talk like that. Like,
Yeah, he did.
he used to laugh and send it on. I said, oh, just being a bit flash.
Right.
I sat and watched him do that.
Right, right. Now, Noel Redding once said, and Buddy Miles said, that at different times they had considered asking you to join the Experience and the Band of Gypsies. Was anything ever said to you like that? That was never brought up to you?
No.
Because Jimmy mentioned your name several times, and he mentioned Traffic as a group.
It was rumored. I remember that.
Mm-hmm. But
It
nobody...
was rumored saying that he wanted to make something. I think
Yeah.
I remember.
Nobody ever kind of phoned me up and said, hey, what are you doing?
Right,
It
right.
was such a sort of like community vibe, though. You kind of got to hear anybody said anything, felt about it, whatever.
Right.
You know, it was just rumored of it. Sometimes never actually got said
Right.
to the parties concerned.
Well, you just heard the tape that just recently surfaced of Jimmy doing Dear Mr. Fantasy. What's your take on that?
Oh, I'm not
Great.
surprised. I found it's
Fantastic.
incredible.
You know,
Incredible.
that's a real, I guess that's his tribute to Traffic.
That is incredible. I never thought that existed.
Well, we were kind of happy to, that had been rumored, that tape, and now it's finally out in circulation. A lot of people get a chance to hear that.
Yeah, it's just an honor. Fantastic. Wish it was a slightly better quality.
Right.
Just to hear him doing it.
Great.
Steve, you, other than the Voodoo Child from Electric Lady, you cut another session with him, isn't that correct?
Yeah, now that may be the time Jim's talking about he went down to Nassau. Because Chris and I went down and cut some other stuff. And he was supposed to do, and we got down there and we hung around as we used to do there and chatting and, smoking or whatever we were doing and
Right.
chatting and then in the end he said, well, the bass player and the drummer haven't turned up. So I played drums and Chris played bass.
Oh, what?
There's a whole load
It's
of stuff.
it's just a jam because I have that too. It's on one of those tapes that
Yeah.
I gave you.
Oh, so there's no release?
No.
Ah, I've got to hear
It's just
that.
There's a
We played that.
that's on a CD which I have
That's
a copy
right.
of, but I'm trying to get
Oh,
you a copy of too. It's got that picture that sits in the living room there of Steve and Jimmy and Eric Bird, and it's called Hendrix and Traffic, a session, although it's not really Traffic. It's just Jimmy and Chris Wood and Steve. And if you listen to the drumming, you can tell that that's not Mitch, 'cause, you're a drummer, every drummer's got his own style, I don't mean to cut your drumming,
Oh,
Steve.
no.
Oh, I'd recognize him.
Right.
No.
Right.
I'd love to. I bet it's great.
But it came later because they're doing bits and pieces pieces of songs.
No, that's not what I mean, though. It's spiritual slightly too.
Okay.
Right.
Because it's the jam.
Oh, right, that's the blues
And then there's
jam.
another track on there where Chris plays flute
Right,
on the double album.
right, right. Oh, that's a thing called 1983,
90.
where he just plays
Yeah.
the flute in the background and Jimmy's just jamming all around what he's
Yeah.
doing there. Yeah, that's great stuff too. Amazing.
But that must have been the same period.
Must have been the same period. I think it was later, though. Something tells me it was after Blue Guitar.
Right, it was.
Yeah.
It was. It had to be 69 or 70
Because
because
that
of the
was
stuff
at
he was
Electric
playing.
Ladyland now.
Oh,
that-
was?
Ah.
I believe.
When I showed you two that piece of footage of Jimmy sitting on the bed in the apartment playing acoustic guitar, you both kind of perked up and went, well, that's the apartment, and you named a street that it was on.
Yeah, it was Top Bond Street. No.
Was it? I thought it was Notting Hill Gate.
I'm sure it was like opposite the place there. Just off.
Well, you'd be better with memory of that than me.
Yeah, it's that
Directions,
street.
streets. It's not my forte.
No, it's that street with the American, the Brook Street.
Brook Street.
Is what it was, Brook Street.
Yeah.
Just corner of Brook Street and Bond Street.
Jimmy, I don't know if you remember, but you had a great line when I showed you that piece of footage. You went, I took me first Mandrax in that room with him. Do you recall that?
That's right.
Yeah.
That was that place, yeah. He had this kind of Indian bedroom.
Right.
Draped in sort of silk Indian Persian.
Right, and the rugs
stuff,
on the wall and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Amazing.
That was a sort of, I guess that was, the first,
How long did
the
Jimmy
first
live in?
pad he had.
How long did he live in England?
Not a very long time because there's one of the places he lived
It's much
in.
shorter than remember when you think back.
Yeah.
I think it seemed like years, but it wasn't. It was such a crowd packed into such a small amount.
He lived in a building or in the same apartment where Handel lived, and some classic music organization wants to put up a plaque to Handel, but there's another bunch of people that want to put up one in memory of Jimmy on the same block there, and they're a little bit at odds about
Handel
that.
and Hendrix.
Right, right. But Hendrix spoke of Handel and likened the old music like that, and the different factions are at odds about that.
He was a true musician, Hendrix. He wasn't, what I call like a rock poet. He was a great songwriter and everything. But I mean, he was a true musician. He understood music.
Right.
All the different.
Yeah.
He used to talk about what goes between the notes. When people would say, oh, you're the greatest guitar player in the world, he'd say, it's not about that, it's about knowing the notes and what goes between the notes. So he in fact, would get embarrassed when people would tell him, oh, you're great. He didn't really want to. There's a Dick Cavett show where Dick Cavett says, you're considered one of the greatest guitar players in the world, and he said, how about the greatest one sitting in this chair, So he kind of tended to downplay that. He got a little embarrassed when people gushed over him like that.
Mm-hmm.
But something, as two guys that knew him, even myself, who's been into it since Jimmy was alive, but I never got to see him in person, and you see photographs of him, for somebody like me that's never met him, even in pictures, he has this just almost supernatural type of aura that surrounds him. Can you say something that brings him down to like a regular guy? Because some people just can't picture him as a regular guy who sits around and shoots a breeze and has a beer and does the things that all regular kind of people do,
Yeah.
It's hard for some people to, even me,
Well,
sometimes.
this is the way he looked.
Yeah.
Yeah. But even then, I remember, when he was in England playing, and when we were at Purple Haze in Wallingford in the square, that was the first time I'd heard it, walking around Wallingford's Market Square.
See.
We went, wow. It was so new, it was Jimmy, it was so good. But then he was like, he was such a sweet, he was such a warm one. This is what I remember most.
Right.
He was so warm.
Completely
He
opposite.
never made you feel uncomfortable. He never made you feel like I'm like
Totally opposite from his stage persona. Then.
Yeah. So,
Sweet.
no, it's interesting to say, just to me, that's all he ever was seemed like a regular guy.
Yeah.
I mean, he wasn't a regular guy like down the pub having pints kind of thing.
Right.
But, you know, because he was a different agenda to that. But, you know, that's all he ever was. I always thought that's really what he was. He wasn't some crazy, you know,
At all.
madman
Right.
at all. He really was a regular gentleman, really. You know.
But he was a real curious, wasn't he? He was so progressive in his thinking musically.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
you could see, he definitely wanted to take the blues and everything else, and he
To
was
another
he was on
dimension.
top of the wave of that whole period that was
Right.
exploding.
He talked about creating what he called at that time today's blues. You know, and people just couldn't seem to see it.
He was wonderfully experimental. I mean, you can hear on the recordings, it was just like 4 or 8 tracks, wasn't it? 4 tracks.
Yeah.
Some of the simple effects and the way he would use the feedback and just effects in the studio are so powerful compared to what you got today, what you could do today.
Right.
In fact, what you got today is too much, in a way. You could overkill, you know. Then you had limited things like the limiters or the ring modulator. You had a few little gadgets like we used on Games to Fantasy,
Right.
the flanger. So you weren't capable of doing like that much. So somehow he made that work very well for him, I thought, in his creative side.
Did you see him as a blues man or as a rock and roll performer?
I saw him. I quite definitely saw him as this. What's the word? You know, like I saw him as a completely, futuristic. You know,
Right.
you could. I mean, just the way he was trying to
Well,
do.
he was an artist, really.
Yeah,
An artist. With
artist,
sound.
totally.
He wasn't a blues man. You know, he was.
But of course, he
based in
had played and
blues.
could play.
Yeah,
You could
right.
see that you knew that he
He's
could.
rooted in blues.
Right.
But
Right.
he.
His
No.
vision was somewhere else. It was
Yeah.
like totally was space. You know?
Yeah.
Do you
Just
see?
the chord stuff. He did little wing, always
Right.
a lovely little chord.
That's
And
right. That was.
that wow wow.
It was
and,
complicated, intricate
almost jazz
music.
come-
You know, it wasn't just anything that was thrown together. It was very, it was very studied. He was
Studied
a
big
very,
knowledge.
had a wide knowledge of music, all forms of music.
Right.
Jazz
But
almost.
then applied that to blues or applied blues.
You know that
to
one?
it.
Dun, 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 please can I talk to you?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
it was almost like a soft jazz.
Yeah, Up from the
thing,
Skies. That's
From
off the
the
second album.
Skies.
Great song.
But his mind, lyrically, mentally, he had such a wonderful, curious mind, didn't he? I think, and he spoke. When he spoke in like cartoon images.
Right. Right. Some of his writing,
very
you can see that.
descriptive and very, mentally visualizing life. So his descriptions of things were interesting,
Right.
curious mind and mercurial mind,
Do you
He
think?
was wonderful, but very charming, sweet. He could be like brother feel, really
Right.
brother feel, rather than I'm this weird electric genius. None of that. He was wonderful, very disarming, charming. He made you feel really great.
He obviously had trouble getting past the image that the record company and management created for him, though.
He knew what he was.
Yeah,
he knew
but
what he.
people
I
couldn't
mean, he
see
knew what
past
he was,
that.
and he knew his image. He knew his impact,
Right. Right.
and he certainly knew how to play it up. He
Right.
definitely, because
No, he did. Yeah.
But he never, outside of that, any other meeting backstage and clubs anyway, he never carried it on in the way that then he acted like a big.
Right. Right.
He just knew what he was and did it on stage with people.
Right,
He
he
knew
didn't take
they
it home
loved
with him, man.
He did the whole 9 yards and
Right.
performed fantastic. But then he was just a cool guy. We
Right.
jammed a few times at like Speakeasy.
Really.
He'd always be there, and we'd just often.
Yeah.
Get out and have a jam, or Noel would be there, Then he had Fat Mattress, Noel Redding, and
Right,
those guys.
right. Now see, this is another great visual for somebody like me, picturing a club in London, and you guys are sitting over here, and Hendrix is over here, and a couple of the Beatles are over here, and Pete Townsend's over here. What an incredible picture, you know, the club scene back then.
Well, anybody who's in town would be there. You know, Janis Joplin, I saw her there.
Right, right.
Keith Moon would be running across the table, what people were trying to eat.
Right, right.
Friendly kind of place.
There's the story, right.
Yeah, everybody went.
Right. Yeah, if they make
Because
time.
Clubland hadn't really started in full, had it? Proper disco club circuit hadn't gotten to be made just in London, you know,
Right.
Bag and Nails, but they were all nightclubs from the old days.
Yeah,
Right.
that's right. There were nightclubs.
The Elbow Room where Traffic got together, it was a nightclub.
Right.
You know, Steve, remember one night
The
you
Elbow
jammed,
Room?
You sang with the Elbow Room. With what's the name? That was the sort of act you'd get in a club, and you'd have some groups, you know, regular progressive rock groups, and then you'd have like Lambert, Hendrix, and Ross. Remember you sang with Annie Ross that night? Both on the piano. That was
I don't
amazing.
know.
That
I
was
don't
a
know those
fantastic
two.
night.
Who was?
They were a great jazz trio.
Right.
Great jazz trio
Well, that's-
in the tradition of
John Hendrix.
Lambert, Hendrix, and Ross. She was
Lambert,
Annie
Hendrix,
Ross,
and Ross.
they were
Yes.
they were fantastic.
Now, see, some people think that was the next progression for him is to go into jazz. You know, and
It was about to because
he touched on
what's his name?
some of the later jams.
Roland Kirk.
Roland.
He was about
jammed
to
with
do a
Roland
thing
Kirk.
with Roland Kirk.
Was he really?
Yeah, because we went to see a gig with Roland Kirk and Charles Lloyd, and Jimmy was supposed to turn up and play with Roland Kirk. Everybody knew.
He did jam
Everybody
with
seemed to
him
know in the
once,
theater.
but it wasn't recorded. There is a tape of Jimmy speaking of jamming with Roland Kirk in a club, and nobody got it on tape. One of the few times that there was not some kind of recording device while he was playing, but he said he was intimidated. Jimmy was. He said, I was afraid to hit a note that I'd get in Roland Kirk's way, you know, that he considered him such a great player.
He was at the time.
I've seen films of him playing, 2 or 3 horns at the same time.
Yeah.
Blowing
That
his brains
circular breathing.
Right.
You couldn't see him breathe. You just blow and you play and play
Right.
and play. You wouldn't seem to be taking a breath.
Right.
But I know Jimmy was definitely going to show up at that concert, the Odeon. Something like the Odeon. And he never did. And that was just prior to Jimmy.
Hammersmith.
Hammersmith. Remember that?
Right. The Hammersmith.
Yeah, he was totally music, Jimmy. Completely. As Steve says, you knew he had just a great sense of the musicality.
Right.
Was just great, you know.
It seems like he was held back by the management, though, from doing what he really wanted to do.
I think he said a lot, though, in that period.
He did.
I mean, he wasn't all about screaming feedback and loud, as you can tell.
Yeah,
The little wing and all
people
this
really don't-
little chord.
And I don't think he was. I think he knew how to handle the media management of people to get across what he wanted. I don't think
Right.
he was restricted. I don't think so.
You don't think? Well, you know, he wanted to experiment with some other lineups, but the management wanted Mitchell and Redding back there and wanted him doing the guitar burning and things like that, because that was generating some bucks. But he really didn't want to do that. You know, he said he got tired of people hollering, "Burn your guitar," and things like that. He would much rather
I
have
know.
stood and played.
Listen, I'll be honest with you. I wasn't sort of like in his face, living out of his bag 24 hours a day.
Right.
I had a strong feeling of Jimmy all through that thing. When we played that gig at the Albert Hall, it was like the end of it, really.
Really?
And there was a big depression. There was a big, dark, black cloud
Well, you know, the
over the
final.
whole thing. And he just stood on the corner of the stage and we played blues. Mitch just sat there. And, you know, it was like totally gone. I mean,
Right.
it was separation.
The final
on stage.
scene of the movie is
It's
him.
all over. Experience was over.
Right.
And what he'd written, and what he'd done, all the great stuff in that period was over. You didn't know what was going to happen next, but it was definitely over. I don't know what he would have done next.
Right.
I'm not sure, but I mean, he had definitely said, you know, first phase, that was it.
Right.
He said it all there in that whatever phase. He obviously would have done something else, but I don't know what he would have done exactly.
Right.
It was like this massive
he bashed his guitar into the amps at the end of that gig, but the final scene of the movie is him sitting backstage shaking his head almost with tears in his eyes. It kind of, touches you to see that, but, you couldn't have hit upon that.
And I hate to say it was almost fatalistic that he'd done it all and said it all. It was like, how can you go on living in a world that was about to turn into, plastic, but it's not far off the road.
Right. When you consider what happened to music shortly after he died.
I world with him in it after that.
Right.
Obviously it would have been great for him not to, but see what else he did. So
With the modern technology.
yeah, but he definitely said it all then, and who knows, maybe that's the way it was meant to be. I mean, he wasn't heavily into drugs, I remember. He wasn't known to be like a complete, collapsing all the time on the edge of.
Everybody caught a buzz.
Go any minute really bad.
Right.
It was probably accidental.
Right.
As far as the sleeping, because that's why I said to you the first thing.
Right.
Flat with these mandrakes prescribed sleeping pills to the doctor that became sort of popular.
But see, that's his
I
image.
believe it was probably that.
Yeah.
With a drink.
But, people that know nothing about him just feel that he was just tripping day and night. That's
there
the
was
way.
a bit of psychedelic.
Oh, sure. Everybody was doing something back then.
He had his share, I suppose.
Oh, sure.
I got the feeling, to be honest, though, that not that he'd come to the end of it, but something had come to a change, an end of a period. And he said so much in those albums.
Right.
And it was definitely over. I don't know what it is, he'd said it, the experience was over. It wasn't due to management or anything else. It had said what it had to say, and the period was about to change anyway, so it was changing.
It's interesting because at that period, that was just about the time when big business discovered that there was big bucks, that rock and roll was making, and that was just that period.
Right.
So it was when I was out with Blind Faith, that was 1969. Before that, it had just been, they just thought it'd been a passing phase, really, that it wasn't really where the big bucks lay with, Petula Clark or possibly the Rolling Stones or the big phenomena, not, I don't know, it was considered, they were just realizing that these crazy young kids making this crazy music that they thought was just a wild, passive thing was actually something that was actually, it had credibility, therefore it could generate money.
You think Woodstock is the event that in '69 that kind of made corporate America go, hey, rock and roll, we can make some big
I think it did. There were
bucks.
lots of things. Woodstock, maybe,
Well, the Blind Faith tour was kind of a big to-do,
because
wasn't it?
I wasn't at Woodstock. We weren't at Woodstock,
Right.
so I don't know about it. But with Blind Faith, suddenly everything snapped in that period.
Photos I've seen of Blind Faith concerts were just huge events.
Yeah.
They were gearing up, yeah.
Mhm.
As it was growing. They were trying to gear up.
Right.
Because this thing was exploding. They were exploding. You know what I mean? In simple Decca, EMI days, people,
Yeah.
and whatever. Harlequin record companies in America were probably still.
Well, look,
I tell you, there was something about that Doors period, Janis. There was something about it where, especially acts like Jimi, that the Stones have always managed. Can't really explain that from a middle class London freaks. They sort of managed to like Marianne and make this roll on a bit more. But Jimi was like an exploding comet. So was Janis.
Right.
So was Jim Morrison. There was something about their whole thing that it was like we splash it on the canvas, but it's like so exciting that we just like physically whack it on now. We don't like take our time, paint over 20 years. know, and
Right,
there's something
right.
about that in there. I thought it was
Right. Like you said, flashed through like a
So-
comet and then gone.
potent.
With the passing of those three, that was kind of the end of that whole era, don't you think?
It was. I remember sat in the speakeasy looking at Jimmy. He was sitting in the corner. I spoke to him. I was there. He was there. He was fairly eager. And he had this whole persona. His hair was like something shorter. He had something on that was just ordinary. There was something about like the period had passed.
Right.
It had passed. The
Flamboyant.
everything.
Psychedelic period.
Well, he'd done it all, said all, he'd toured, he'd gone through. And that was just not long before. And I saw him and I sat there. It was
Basically, the 60s had finished, I suppose.
It kind of
Okay.
finished.
Was it
1970.
that he died?
Right.
And I looked at him and it was just, he just ran through my head, you know, such as you do. You know, you just think to yourself. It's just one of those things. It's like, what now? What next? It was a what next thing. Like, that was great, wasn't it? It's just like all gone. So I don't know, that was that right in that period of transition to whatever would be next. But it was definitely like a down thing of like, wow, how can you follow that?
Right.
It was how can you follow that line?
Right.
So anyway.
Well, as a fan, it's good that a lot of you guys are still with us, though, and still making music. I think. You know,
Well,
some of us
we
oldies are
weren't
still.
the Flash, not Flash. I mean, we weren't that explosively like even Steve was at the ground with all the going burning up the Leslie with fire.
Flashing a pan. We weren't flashing a pan. We
Right.
were a band.
Right.
We were,
It wasn't about generating that. So
you know,
much.
we were kind of going along with the
We were musically experimental.
kind of social changes that were going on. Hendrix in a way was, you know, that's the thing about the 60s, the late 60s, big social change went on, and somehow music became the figurehead, the vanguard for all this social change, which it wasn't, I don't think really, but it became part of it. There were changes going on in music, but it became, you know, the symbol for the whole social
Movement, yeah.
upheaval, which, you know, we said, you know, yeah, great, we'll have some of that kind of thing. But I mean, you know, we were just developing music, we thought, and I think to a certain extent Jimmy was too, but Jimmy somehow,
Epitomized more.
there was something more with Jimmy, perhaps, you know, being a black American or something. There was big social change going on in America as well, which perhaps he couldn't have done what he did in England,
Right.
in America. So he went to England to actually use that social change. But that was, to me, that was the side, really, even for him, because it was a big musical development that he was making. And to me, that was his main thing. You know, just because I'm a musician, I'm not saying music's any more important than anything else, but for me, that was the important thing. And I suspect, to a certain extent, to him, that was his main vision. But also he saw how it hooked up with the whole social
The
change
visual.
that was going on. And so he went along with it and he knew how to control it, you know, and he knew how to handle it as well, I think.
Well, that sounds to me like a good note to end on. Wonderful. I do appreciate
The
you.
Electric Prince.
Yes. Well
as I
said.
call it.
Well said.
All right, friends, I hope you enjoyed that little time capsule recorded nearly 3 decades ago. Steve Winwood and the late, great Jim Capaldi, remembering their friend Jimi Hendrix and what the music scene was like back during the day. You know, 2 nicer guys you couldn't hope to meet, and I am eternally grateful to them for letting me record that conversation. And it was thrilling to sit there with them and hear them remember all that history And I'd like to dedicate this this episode and all of this to Jim Capaldi. Once again, a super nice guy. And I've done a slideshow throughout this of some of the pictures made here and some of the pictures of them with Jimmy. But there was a moment, which I'll have to clean up for you a little bit, when they were standing in the corner behind me, and Capaldi looked around the room, and I can't do his accent, but he said, "This is a great effing room. I love this room," and I'll never forget that. It was one of the great days of my life. So, to Steve and to Jim, thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed this, and we'll see you in the next video.